going to start with what in some ways is probably the most obvious, but often the least kind of focused on when we work with real customers in terms of, it's probably the most important part of the process. And it's the most, in some ways it's the least technical in terms of, challenge, but it's often the one that's really not thought of in the front of the process. And people often deal with the challenges at the back end, which is just really establishing your governance overall framework. So how do you, in a company of any size, from the smallest firms to the most complex global, international firms, how do you define ultimately the ownership for security as code? How do you, the cloud, as my team, always reminds me, is a team sport. So how do you ensure that all the different groups across different forms of actors are working together in a way that's collaborative to drive ultimately the shared outcomes that are there? How do you define and ultimately create a role and responsibility structure that supports the ability to map people and roles to specific problems and specific responsibilities? So, how do you look at the different jurisdictions in your organization? Who's allowed to define controls for which part of your cloud usage or your business? Which are the people that are allowed to see the results? So there's a very fundamental aspect here of really thinking through the governance framework that is going to be essential to underpin what becomes kind of the trust layer, so that as you're looking at results of findings from a policy as code or security as code part of your infrastructure that's operating, how can you trust it? How can you know that it's correct? Who actually defined it? How do you know that person had the responsibility to decide those were the right set of rules?